The transport shuttle broke through the docking bay doors of Apex 7 station with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Minho pressed his face against the small window, watching the massive military academy grow larger as they approached. The station stretched across space like a metal continent, its surface covered with training grounds, simulation centers, and weapon testing facilities. Somewhere inside that maze of corridors and chambers, he would spend the next 4 years learning to become something the galaxy had never quite seen before. A human warrior trained in alien combat arts. The shuttle touched down with barely a tremor. Minho grabbed his single bag and followed the stream of cadets toward the main entrance. Around him walked beings from dozens of worlds. A towering Krillian moved past, its forearms carrying equipment with casual ease. 3 Mantari cadets walked together, their insect-like bodies covered in ceremonial armor that clicked softly with each step. A group of Scaloth reptilians hissed to each other in their native tongue, their scales gleaming under the station's artificial lights. Minho felt small. Not just physically, though. At average human height, he stood shorter than most species here. He felt small in experience, in heritage, in the weight of tradition that other species carried like invisible armor. Earth had only joined the galactic community 30 years ago. These other species had been warriors for thousands of years, their combat techniques refined across centuries of interstellar conflict. The orientation hall was enormous. Minho found a seat near the back and watched as the room filled with cadets. He counted 3 other humans in the crowd of over 200 students. One was Hyejin, a woman from Seoul who had scored perfect marks on every entrance examination. She caught his eye and nodded once before turning her attention to the front of the hall. The lights dimmed. A holographic display flickered to life above the stage, showing images of legendary warriors from across the galaxy. Then the instructor walked out and the room fell silent. Instructor Vexitar was a Krillian standing nearly 8 feet tall. His forearms moved with careful precision as he approached the podium. His skin had the dark purple hue of someone who had lived multiple human lifetimes. Scars crossed his face and arms, each one a story from battles fought across the stars. "Welcome to Apex 7 Military Academy," Vexitar said, his voice carrying easily through the hall without electronic amplification. "You are here because your governments believe you have potential. I am here to prove them wrong or right." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. "Most of you will fail," Vexitar continued, "not because you lack courage or strength, but because you cannot adapt. The galaxy is vast and filled with enemies who do not fight by your rules, who do not respect your traditions, and who will kill you without hesitation if you cannot respond to the unexpected." The holographic display shifted, showing a complex schedule of courses: combat theory, tactical analysis, weapons engineering, survival protocols. The list went on for several minutes. "But there is one course that matters more than all others," Vexitar said. "Weapons design. Every warrior in this academy must create their own weapon. Not purchase one. Not inherit one from your ancestors. Create it with your own hands and your own mind." The display changed again, showing various weapons crafted by previous students. Energy blades that hummed with power. Graviton hammers that could crush stone with a thought. Biocrystalline projectiles that grew sharper with each use. Each weapon was a masterpiece of technology and artistry. "At the end of this semester, you will present your weapon to the Academy Council," Vexitar explained. "You will demonstrate its effectiveness in combat. You will explain its design philosophy, and you will prove that you understand what it means to be a warrior. Those who fail this challenge will be expelled." Minho felt his stomach tighten. He had barely passed the technology aptitude tests during entrance examinations. While other species grew up surrounded by advanced alien engineering, humans still used relatively primitive tools. Earth's most sophisticated weapons were crude, compared to what the rest of the galaxy considered standard equipment. After the orientation ended, cadets filed out into the corridor, talking excitedly about weapon designs and combat techniques. Minho walked slowly, lost in thought, until someone bumped into him hard enough to make him stumble. "Watch where you're going." "Human." Minho looked up at a Scaloth cadet who stood a full head taller than him. The reptilian's scales were a deep green color, and his eyes were the cold yellow of a predator. A small group of other Scaloth students stood behind him, all wearing expressions of amusement. "Sorry," Minho said, stepping aside. "Sorry," the Scaloth mimicked in a mocking tone. "Tell me, human, why did your species even apply to this academy? You have no combat tradition. Your weapons are simple projectile throwers and chemical explosives. Your bodies are weak and fragile. What exactly do you think you can contribute here? Minho felt heat rise in his face, but he kept his voice level. I guess we'll find out during the semester. The Scaloth laughed, a sound like rocks scraping together. I am Diane, and I come from a warrior lineage that stretches back 3,000 years. My ancestors forged plasma blades before your species discovered fire. I will create a weapon that honors that tradition. What will you create? A pointed stick? The other Scaloth students laughed. Minho clenched his fists but said nothing. There was no point in arguing. Words wouldn't prove anything here. Leave him alone, Dane. Hyejin stepped between them, her expression calm but her stance radiating confidence. She was smaller than Minho, but something about her presence made even Diane hesitate. This doesn't concern you, human, Diane said. We're all cadets here, Hyejin replied. Save your energy for the actual challenges instead of wasting it on stupid intimidation games. Dane stared at her for a long moment, then snorted and walked away, his friends following. When they were gone, Hyejin turned to Minho. Don't let them get to you, she said. They're scared. Scared of what? Of being wrong, Hyejin said. Every species here has centuries of tradition telling them they know the right way to fight. Humans don't have that burden. We can approach problems differently. That terrifies them more than they'll admit. Minho nodded slowly. Thanks. Don't thank me yet, Hyejin said with a slight smile. We still have to actually create weapons that work, and I have no idea how we're going to do that. They walked together toward the dormitory section, joining the flow of cadets settling into their new lives. Around them, alien students discussed plasma forging techniques and graviton manipulation theories. Minho listened to conversations he only partially understood, wondering how he would possibly compete with beings who had literally been born into warrior cultures. That night, lying in his small quarters aboard the station, Minho stared at the ceiling and thought about his grandfather. The old man had served in the Korean War, fighting with weapons that would seem laughably primitive by galactic standards. But he had survived. He had adapted. He had done what needed to be done with whatever tools he had available. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all any warrior could do. Outside his window, the stars shone cold and distant, and somewhere among them were enemies humanity would eventually face. Minho closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing the real challenges would begin tomorrow. The fabrication laboratory occupied an entire level of Apex 7 station. Minho stood at the entrance with 30 other cadets from his class section, staring at equipment he barely recognized. The room stretched far into the distance, filled with machines that hummed, glowed, and occasionally sparked with energy that made his hair stand on end. Instructor Vextar led them inside, his 4 arms gesturing at different stations as he walked. Molecular assemblers can build any object atom by atom. Plasma forges can heat materials to temperatures that would vaporize your home planets. Graviton shapers manipulate gravity itself to fold and compress matter. Biosynthesis chambers grow living weapons from genetic templates. Minho tried to follow along, but the explanations quickly moved beyond his understanding. The other cadets nodded and asked technical questions about calibration settings and energy requirements. A Mentari student named Bora raised one of her thin arms and asked about biocrystallization rates. Vextar launched into a detailed explanation that involved quantum states and molecular bonding that Minho could not follow at all. You have 3 weeks, Vextar announced. The laboratory is open at all hours. You may use any equipment and any materials available in the storage facilities. Your only limitation is your own imagination and skill. The cadets spread out immediately, claiming workstations and pulling up holographic design interfaces. Minho wandered through the lab slowly, watching others work with confidence he could not imagine feeling. Dine stood at a plasma forge, already sketching weapon designs in the air with gestures that made holographic blueprints appear. The blade he was designing curved like a traditional Scaloth warrior's sword, but energy crackled along its edge in the simulation. Hyejin had claimed a station near the molecular assemblers. She caught Minho's eye and waved him over. Pretty overwhelming, right? She said, her fingers dancing through holographic menus. I barely understand what half these machines do, Minho admitted. Hyejin nodded. Me too, but I've been reading the technical manuals since we arrived. Look, I'm thinking of creating an energy spear, something with reach and power. The Krillians have this technique called dimensional folding, where you can store energy in compressed space and release it on impact. She pulled up a design that showed a spear with a blade made of pure contained energy. The schematics included equations and diagrams that might as well have been ancient hieroglyphics to Minho. "That's incredible," Minho said, and he meant it. "What about you? What are you thinking of making?" Minho looked around the lab at all the advanced technology. "I honestly don't know. I need to figure out how to use this equipment first." Over the next several days, Minho tried. He read manuals written in 12 different languages, translated by computer into Korean, but still filled with technical terms that had no equivalent in human vocabulary. He watched tutorial videos that assumed knowledge of physics and engineering principles he had never learned. He attempted to use the molecular assembler and managed only to create a lump of fused metal that wouldn't even hold an edge. The other cadets made steady progress. Bora completed a set of throwing weapons made from biocrystal that could penetrate armor and then grow roots to anchor themselves in the target. A Krillian student whose name Minho could not pronounce forged a hammer that generated gravity waves on impact. Even the other human students seemed to be adapting better than him. One was creating a modified railgun using Earth technology as a base. Another was working on chemical explosive devices enhanced with alien materials. Minho spent hours each day in the fabrication lab, growing more frustrated with each failed attempt. The machines responded to mental commands through neural interfaces, but Minho's thoughts seemed incompatible with how the technology wanted to be operated. When he tried to shape metal with the graviton manipulator, it either did nothing or twisted the material into useless knots. On the 8th day, Dane found Minho sitting alone at a workstation, staring at another failed prototype. "Still trying to figure out which end of the hammer to hold, human?" Dane asked, his voice dripping with amusement. Minho said nothing. He had learned that responding only encouraged more mockery. "My weapon is nearly complete," Dane continued, holding up a holographic image. The plasma blade gleamed with deadly beauty, its edge sharp enough to cut through nearly any material. 3,000 years of Scaloth weaponsmithing knowledge went into this design. It honors my ancestors and demonstrates my worth as a warrior. Dane leaned closer, his yellow eyes studying Minho with something between pity and contempt. "What will you present to the council? What knowledge do humans have to draw upon? 30 years in the galaxy, and you're still playing with tools you barely understand." After Dane left, Minho sat in silence for a long time. The fabrication lab hummed around him, filled with the sounds of creation and progress. Everyone except him seemed to know exactly what they were doing. Everyone except him had a plan that made sense. That evening, Instructor Vextar found Minho still sitting at his workstation, surrounded by failed prototypes and abandoned designs. "Cadet Minho," Vextar said, his deep voice startling Minho from his thoughts. "Instructor?" Minho stood quickly, trying to look like he had been working rather than wallowing in self-pity. Vexatar's forearms crossed in a gesture that Minho had learned meant the instructor was thinking carefully about something. "You have spent more hours in this laboratory than any other student in your class section, yet you have produced nothing functional." "I know, sir. I'm trying to learn the equipment, but it's more complicated than I expected." "All cadets face challenges," Vextar said. "The Mantarii struggle with heavy weapons because their bodies are not designed for such tools. The Scaloth sometimes become too attached to tradition and cannot innovate. The Krillians occasionally create weapons so complex they become impractical in real combat." Vextar paused, studying Minho with eyes that held centuries of experience. "What challenges do humans face?" Minho thought about the question. "We're new to all of this. We don't have thousands of years of tradition to guide us. We don't instinctively understand how alien technology works. We're behind everyone else in almost every way." "And is that truly a disadvantage?" Vextar asked. Before Minho could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Red emergency lights flashed and a recorded voice announced a drill in progress. Combat simulations were beginning in the training sector. "Think about my question, Cadet Minho," Vextar said as he moved toward the exit. "Sometimes the greatest advantage is having nothing to rely on except yourself." The instructor left and Minho was alone in the fabrication lab. Around him, partially completed weapons sat on workstations where other cadets had left them, energy blades in charging cradles, gravity hammers on reinforced stands, biocrystal projectiles growing in nutrient baths. Minho picked up one of his failed prototypes, a simple knife he had tried to forge using the plasma equipment. The blade was warped and uneven, the handle poorly balanced. It was, by any objective measure, a terrible weapon. But he had made it with his own hands using tools he barely understood, and it would still cut if pressed into flesh. Minho thought about his grandfather's stories. Soldiers in frozen trenches with rifles that jammed from the cold. Marines landing on beaches with equipment half destroyed by seawater. Warriors throughout human history who had fought with whatever they could carry, repair, and keep functional under the worst possible conditions. What did humans know about weapons? They knew how to make do. They knew how to improvise. They knew how to keep fighting when everything went wrong. Minho set down the failed knife and looked around the laboratory with new eyes. All of this technology was impressive, but it was also complicated. It required specific materials, precise conditions, and extensive knowledge. What happened when those things weren't available? What happened in the chaos of real combat when machines failed and power cells depleted? He didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time since arriving at the academy, Minho felt like he might be asking the right questions. 2 weeks remained until the presentation deadline. Minho had no completed weapon, no clear design, and no confidence that he could successfully use the advanced fabrication equipment even if he had a plan. But somewhere in the back of his mind, an idea was beginning to form. It was small and uncertain, barely more than a feeling, but it whispered that maybe being behind everyone else wasn't the disadvantage he had always assumed. 1 week remained before the weapon presentations, and Minho still had nothing to show. He sat in the fabrication laboratory late at night, the only cadet still working while others slept or socialized in the common areas. The equipment around him hummed with power, waiting for someone skilled enough to use it properly. Minho was not that person. He had spent the evening trying one last time to use the molecular assembler. The device could theoretically create any object by arranging individual atoms in precise patterns. All it required was a clear mental image transmitted through the neural interface, plus an understanding of molecular structures, and the patience to guide trillions of atoms into their correct positions. Minho closed his eyes and pressed his hands against the interface pad. He pictured a simple combat knife, something basic that any human blacksmith could have forged 500 years ago. The machine hummed in response, and holographic displays showed atoms beginning to arrange themselves. For a moment, Minho felt hope rising in his chest. Then something went wrong. The pattern destabilized. Atoms scattered instead of bonding. The machine made a sound like metal tearing, and smoke began pouring from the assembler's core mechanism. Minho yanked his hands away as sparks erupted from the control panel. Alarms shrieked through the laboratory. Emergency systems activated automatically, spraying fire suppression foam across the damaged equipment. Within seconds, lab technicians came running from their monitoring station. A Krillian technician pushed past Minho and began working on the assembler with 3 of his 4 arms, while the 4th operated a diagnostic scanner. "What happened?" the technician demanded. "I was trying to create a basic knife design," Minho explained, his voice shaking. The pattern just collapsed. The technician studied his scanner, his expression growing darker. "You destabilized the quantum matrix. This assembler will need complete recalibration. That's 3 days of work minimum." Instructor Vextar arrived moments later, drawn by the alarms. He surveyed the smoking equipment and the technicians working frantically to contain the damage. His forearms crossed as he turned to Minho. "Explain," Vextar said simply. Minho told him what had happened. As he spoke, other cadets began arriving, drawn by curiosity about the commotion. Dane pushed to the front of the growing crowd, saw Minho standing next to the damaged equipment, and laughed. "The human breaks things he doesn't understand," Dane announced loudly. "Perhaps next he can damage the plasma forges or destroy the graviton shapers. Why not ruin all the equipment before the rest of us can complete our weapons?" A few other students laughed. Most simply watched, waiting to see what would happen. Vextar raised one hand and silence fell immediately. "Cadet Minho, you are banned from using the advanced fabrication equipment for the remainder of the semester. You will complete your weapon using only basic tools and materials." "But instructor," Minho protested, "I need the equipment to create anything functional. Without it, I can't possibly compete with the other cadets." "Then you will fail," Vextar said flatly. "Those are the consequences of your carelessness. You have 7 days to present something to the Academy Council, or you will be expelled from this institution." Vextar left without another word. The technicians continued their repairs. The other cadets slowly dispersed, some giving Minho sympathetic looks, others appearing satisfied that he had been set back so dramatically. Dine was the last to leave, making sure to shoulder-check Minho on his way out. Minho stood alone in the laboratory, surrounded by machines he was no longer permitted to use. 7 days. He had 7 days to create a weapon that could somehow measure up to plasma blades and graviton hammers and biocrystal projectiles. 7 days to prove he belonged at this academy, that humanity deserved a place among the warrior species of the galaxy. He had no idea how to do that. The next morning, Minho skipped his scheduled classes and wandered through the station instead. He couldn't face sitting in tactical analysis lectures while his future crumbled around him. Other cadets would be refining their weapons, making final adjustments, practicing demonstration routines. Minho had nothing to refine, nothing to adjust, nothing to practice with. He found himself in one of the empty practice rooms, a space used for combat training when classes weren't in session. The room was simple and functional, with padded floors, weapon racks along one wall, and a few chairs for instructors to observe training sessions. Minho sat in one of the chairs, his head in his hands. Everything felt impossible. The technology was too advanced, the timeline too short, the expectations too high. Maybe Dane had been right. Maybe humans simply weren't ready for this level of competition. Maybe Earth had pushed too hard to join the galactic community too soon. He thought about his grandfather again. The old man who had fought in a war before space travel, before first contact, before humanity knew it was anything but alone in the universe. His grandfather had told him stories about the cold and the fear and the desperation of combat. But he had also talked about adaptability, about soldiers who learned to improvise and overcome when everything went wrong. The best weapon is the one you have when you need it, his grandfather had said. Fancy equipment fails, supply chains break, plans collapse. What matters is what you can do with your hands and your mind when everything else is gone. Minho lifted his head and looked around the practice room. Weapon racks held training equipment, padded sticks, practice blades with dulled edges, weighted clubs for strength training. None of it was real weaponry, certainly nothing he could present to the Academy Council. His eyes fell on the chairs. There were 6 of them arranged in a row, simple furniture designed for one purpose, to provide a place to sit while observing training. Basic construction, sturdy materials, nothing fancy or complicated. Minho stood and walked over to one of the chairs. He picked it up, felt its weight in his hands. It was lighter than he expected, but solid, made from some kind of composite material that felt almost like wood, but stronger. The legs were cylindrical and smooth, each one about 3 feet long and 2 inches in diameter. The seat and backrest were formed from a single piece of shaped material. An idea began forming in Minho's mind. Not a fully formed plan, but the beginning of something. A memory from Earth, from human history, from before any of this advanced technology existed. Spears, the oldest weapons in human history. Pointed sticks used by hunters and warriors for tens of thousands of years. Simple, effective, requiring no power cells or rare materials or advanced knowledge. Just a shaft and a point. Balanced for throwing or thrusting, deadly in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. Minho looked at the chair leg in his hand and saw not furniture but potential. He turned it over, examining the joints where it connected to the seat. Could he break it apart? Could he shape it into something functional? The door to the practice room opened and Hyejin walked in. She stopped when she saw Minho standing there, holding a chair leg like it was precious. "I heard about what happened in the lab," she said carefully. "Everyone's talking about it." "I'm sure they are," Minho replied, setting the chair down. Hyejin walked closer, her expression concerned. "What are you going to do? You can't use any of the fabrication equipment and there's less than a week left." "I don't know yet," Minho admitted, "but I'm starting to think I've been approaching this entire challenge wrong from the beginning." "What do you mean?" Minho gestured at the chair. "Everyone in our class is creating weapons using technology they've spent their whole lives learning to understand. The Scaloth use plasma forging because their species has refined that technique for thousands of years. The Mentari use biocrystallization because it matches their natural abilities. Even you're using dimensional folding because you studied Krillian engineering techniques." "Right," Hyejin said slowly. "That's how you create an effective weapon. You use the best available technology and knowledge." "But that's not what humans do," Minho said. the idea crystallizing in his mind even as he spoke. Humans don't wait for the perfect technology or the ideal conditions. We use whatever's available right now in this moment with these hands. He picked up the chair again and held it in both hands. For thousands of years, humans fought with sharpened sticks and stones and bones. We didn't have plasma or graviton technology. We just had whatever we could find or make. And we learned to use it effectively enough to survive and conquer and spread across an entire planet. Hyejin stared at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. You're going to make a spear out of a chair. Maybe, Minho said. Or maybe I'm going to fail spectacularly and get expelled. But at least I'll fail doing something that feels like the right approach, not trying to badly copy what every other species does better than me. Hyejin was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. You know what? That might be the most human thing I've heard anyone say since we got here. Good luck, Minho. She left him alone in the practice room. Minho looked at the chair in his hands and made his decision. He had 7 days and no access to advanced technology, but he had his hands, his mind, and thousands of years of human stubbornness backing him up. It would have to be enough. Minho returned to his quarters and retrieved his personal equipment bag. Inside were the basic tools he had brought from Earth. A folding knife that had belonged to his grandfather, a small multi-tool, cord made from synthetic fibers, basic adhesive tape, and a sharpening stone. Nothing impressive by galactic standards, certainly nothing compared to the molecular assemblers and plasma forges in the fabrication laboratory, but these were tools he understood. Tools that worked the way human hands expected them to work. He carried the bag back to the empty practice room and locked the door behind him. If he was going to do this, he needed privacy. Other cadets would mock him enough when he presented the final product. He didn't need their laughter during the creation process as well. Minho set the chair on the floor and studied it carefully. The legs attached to the seat through simple joints, held in place by friction and a small amount of adhesive. He tested one joint, applying pressure at different angles until he understood how the pieces fit together. Then, carefully, using the handle of his knife as a hammer and his multi-tool as a lever, he began disassembling the chair. The first leg came free with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty room. Minho examined it closely. The composite material was dense and heavy, with a slight grain running lengthwise like wood but more uniform. The surface was smooth but not slippery, perfect for gripping. The length was good, maybe a few inches shorter than ideal for a spear, but workable. He spent the next several hours dismantling the rest of the chair and sorting the pieces. 4 legs all identical, a seat section that could potentially be carved into a spearhead, if he could shape the material properly. Various smaller connecting pieces that might serve as counterweights or reinforcement. Minho selected the straightest chair leg and laid it across his knees. Using his grandfather's knife, he began the slow process of shaping the tip into a point. The composite material was harder than wood but softer than metal. The blade cut it cleanly when he used proper technique, but it required patience and steady hands. Hours passed. His fingers grew tired and his back ached from hunching over his work, but Minho continued. He carved away thin layers of material, testing the point regularly against a piece of scrap to ensure it was becoming genuinely sharp. The practice room had a small water dispenser in one corner. He used it to wet the sharpening stone and spent another hour honing the spear tip until it could pierce the padded training mats with minimal pressure. The door chimed. Someone was requesting entry. Minho considered ignoring it, but the chime sounded again, more insistently this time. He opened the door. Dane stood in the corridor, accompanied by 2 other Scaloth students. They looked past Minho at the dismantled chair and the partially shaped spear lying on the floor. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Dane began laughing. It was a harsh, mocking sound that made something tight and angry curl in Minho's chest. I heard rumors, Dane said between laughs. I heard that the human who destroyed the molecular assembler was locked in a practice room, working on something secret. I thought perhaps you had found some clever solution, some hidden knowledge your primitive species possessed. He gestured at the chair parts scattered across the floor. But this? This is your weapon? A broken chair? A sharpened stick? The other Scaloth students joined in the laughter. One of them said something in their own language, and all 3 laughed harder. Minho felt his face burning, but he kept his voice steady. It's not finished yet. Of course not, Dane said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. How could it be finished? You're trying to compete with plasma blades and graviton weapons using furniture. Do you understand how pathetic this is? Do you understand that you're embarrassing not just yourself, but your entire species? Maybe, Minho said quietly. Or maybe I understand something you don't. Dane's laughter died. Enlighten me then, human. What is it that I, with 3,000 years of warrior tradition in my bloodline, failed to understand? Minho looked down at the partially completed spear, then back at Dane. That the most advanced weapon in the galaxy is useless if it breaks, runs out of power, or requires materials you don't have. This spear will work anywhere, anytime, with nothing but a stick and a sharp edge. And it will be destroyed the moment it faces a real weapon, Dane replied. My plasma blade will cut through your wooden stick like it's nothing. Your primitive approach will fail, just as humanity will eventually fail in the greater galaxy. You're too slow, too weak, too dependent on simple solutions in a complex universe. Dane turned to leave, then paused. I almost pity you, Minho. Tomorrow, when I present my weapon to the Academy Council, I will demonstrate 3,000 years of refined technique and power. What will you demonstrate? That humans can break furniture? The 3 Scaloth students left, their laughter echoing down the corridor. Minho closed and locked the door again, then stood silently in the center of the practice room. Doubt crept in like cold water. Maybe Dane was right. Maybe this was stupid. Maybe he should just accept failure and return to Earth rather than humiliate himself in front of the entire Academy Council. He picked up the partially shaped spear and turned it over in his hands. The weight was good. The balance was improving as he shaped the tip. It wasn't beautiful or impressive, but it was functional. It was real. Minho thought about his grandfather fighting in frozen mountains with a rifle that jammed in the cold. He thought about human soldiers throughout history, who had faced superior enemies with inferior weapons and won anyway through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. He thought about humanity itself, clawing its way up from caves and stone tools to cities and spacecraft, never waiting for perfect conditions, always making do with what was available. He sat back down and picked up his knife. There was still work to do. Over the next several days, Minho refined the spear with meticulous care. He heat-treated the tip using a small plasma cutter, the only piece of equipment he was still allowed to touch. The process took hours of careful temperature control, but the result was a point that was significantly harder and sharper than the untreated material. He wrapped the shaft at key stress points with the synthetic cord from his equipment bag, creating grip points that would prevent his hands from slipping during use. He carved small grooves near the balance point to improve handling. He tested the spear over and over, throwing it at training dummies and padded walls, making tiny adjustments each time until it flew straight and true. On the 5th day, Eugene visited again. She brought food from the station's cafeteria and sat with Minho while he ate and worked simultaneously. I finished my energy spear, she said. It took me 18 hours straight, but I got the dimensional folding matrices to stabilize. The blade can cut through 6 inches of reinforced steel. That's amazing, Minho said, and meant it sincerely. Hyejin watched him work for a while. You know everyone's talking about you, right? Some people think you're brave for trying something different. Others think you've lost your mind. What do you think? She considered the question carefully. I think you're doing the only thing you can do with the situation you're in. And I think maybe that's what being human means. We don't have the luxury of thousands of years of tradition to fall back on. We just have to figure things out as we go. On the 6th day, Minho completed his weapon. It was a spear approximately 6 feet long, with a point sharp enough to pierce armor and a shaft reinforced at critical locations. The weight was balanced perfectly for his height and arm strength. It was simple, functional, and entirely primitive compared to everything else that would be presented to the Academy Council. Minho practiced with it through the night, running through combat forms he had learned during basic training, throwing and retrieving it hundreds of times until the movements became automatic. The spear felt good in his hands, not powerful like an energy blade or devastating like a graviton hammer, just reliable, predictable, and effective. The morning of the presentation arrived. Minho dressed in his formal cadet uniform and picked up his spear. As he walked toward the demonstration arena, other cadets stared at his weapon with expressions ranging from confusion to amusement to pity. In the corridors, he passed Dane carrying his completed plasma blade. The Scaloth's weapon hummed with power, its edge glowing with contained energy that could slice through nearly any material. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Dane saw Minho's spear and smiled coldly. "Good luck today, human. You're going to need it." Minho said nothing. He just kept walking toward whatever judgment awaited him, carrying a sharpened stick he had made from a broken chair, and hoping it would be enough to prove that humanity belonged among the stars. The demonstration arena was enormous, with seating for several hundred spectators rising in tiers around a central combat floor. The Academy Council sat in an elevated platform at one end, 5 beings representing different species and military traditions. Instructor Vextar stood with them, his forearms crossed as he watched cadets file into the arena. Minho found a seat in the cadet section and watched as the presentations began. One by one, students walked onto the combat floor, displayed their weapons, and demonstrated their capabilities against various targets and challenges. Each presentation was more impressive than the last. A Krillian student presented a hammer that generated localized gravity wells on impact, crushing training dummies into compact spheres of compressed matter. The council members nodded approvingly and took notes on their datapads. Bora, the Mentarii cadet, demonstrated her biocrystal throwing weapons. They pierced reinforced targets and then grew roots that anchored them in place, making extraction nearly impossible. The crowd applauded as she expertly hit 6 moving targets in rapid succession. Then Dane took the floor. He walked with confident pride, holding his plasma blade at his side. The weapon's hum filled the arena, a sound of barely contained power waiting to be unleashed. "Honored Council," Dane began, his voice carrying clearly through the space. "I present a weapon that honors 3,000 years of Scaloth warrior tradition, enhanced with modern plasma technology." He activated the blade fully, and its edge blazed with energy that cast flickering light across the arena floor. Then, with movements that were both graceful and deadly, Dane began his demonstration. He cut through steel targets like they were paper. He deflected energy blasts with the blade's edge. He demonstrated combat forms that had been refined over centuries, each strike precise and devastating. The performance was flawless. When Dane finished, the council members conferred briefly before announcing their assessment. Excellent marks across all categories: design, craftsmanship, combat effectiveness, and innovation within tradition. Dane returned to his seat, not even glancing at Minho as he passed. More presentations followed. Yijin's turn came, and Minho watched with genuine admiration as she demonstrated her dimensional energy spear. The weapon's blade could extend and retract, change angles, and store kinetic energy from blocked attacks to release in powerful counterstrikes. The council praised her innovative application of Krillian technology. Then Instructor Vextar called out, "Cadet Minho, you're next." The arena fell silent. Minho stood, gripping his spear, and walked down to the combat floor. He could feel hundreds of eyes watching him, could hear the whispers starting among the spectators. He saw cadets pointing at his weapon, saw the confusion on the council members' faces. Minho stood at attention before the council platform and waited. One of the council members, a being whose species Minho didn't recognize, spoke first. "Cadet Minho, please present your weapon." Minho held up the spear. In the arena's bright lighting, it looked even more primitive than he had feared. Just a wooden stick with a sharpened point and some cord wrapping. Nothing impressive, nothing powerful. Nothing that hummed or glowed or demonstrated advanced technology. "This is a spear," Minho said simply, "created from materials available in any environment, requiring no power source, no rare elements, and no advanced fabrication technology." The council members exchanged glances. One of them, a Scaloth elder even larger than Dane, leaned forward. "Cadet, are you aware that this challenge requires cadets to demonstrate their understanding of modern weapons technology? Your submission appears to be primitive." "Yes, Counselor," Minho replied. "It is primitive. That's the point." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Instructor Vextar raised one hand and silence returned. "Explain," Vextar said. Minho took a breath and began. "Every weapon presented today has been impressive and powerful, but they all share common limitations. They require specific materials that may not be available in all environments. They depend on power cells that eventually deplete. They need maintenance and repair that assumes access to advanced facilities." He held up his spear again. "This weapon requires only a stick and something to sharpen it with. It works in any gravity, any atmosphere, any environment. It never runs out of power because it needs no power. And if it breaks during combat, Minho turned and, without warning, smashed the spear against his knee with all his strength. The wooden shaft cracked and split into 2 pieces. Gasps echoed through the arena. Dawn's laughter was loud and mocking. "Then I have 2 weapons instead of 1. Minho finished, holding up both pieces. He walked to one of the steel targets used in previous demonstrations and, using the broken end of the spear, began scraping it against the target's edge. Within seconds, he had created a new sharp point on the broken shaft. A weapon that adapts when damaged, that can be repaired with nothing but friction and patience, that requires no supply chain or technical knowledge beyond basic physics. The council members were leaning forward now, their expressions shifting from confusion to interest. "Demonstrate its combat effectiveness," Vextar commanded. Minho nodded. He set down the broken pieces and retrieved the intact spear he had kept as backup. The arena's combat systems activated, and training drones began emerging from ports in the walls. The first scenario tested accuracy. Moving targets appeared at various distances. Minho threw his spear, hitting the targets with practiced precision. When the spear became stuck in a target beyond his reach, he retrieved one of the broken pieces from earlier and used it to strike closer targets instead. The second scenario introduced defensive challenges. Energy blasts fired from automated turrets. Other weapons had deflected these attacks with energy shields or graviton fields. Minho simply dodged and used the arena's obstacles for cover, demonstrating that sometimes the best defense was not being where the attack landed. The third scenario was close combat against training dummies that simulated various alien species. Minho worked through them systematically, using the spear's reach to keep distance, its point to strike vital areas, and its shaft to block and deflect incoming attacks. Then Vextar changed the parameters. Environmental modification, underwater combat. The arena floor opened and water flooded in rapidly. The advanced weapons from previous demonstrations would have struggled in this environment. Energy blades required recalibration for water resistance. Graviton hammers experienced interference from the liquid medium. Biocrystal weapons couldn't grow properly in non-atmospheric conditions. Minho's spear worked exactly the same as before. He moved through the water, which slowed him down but didn't affect the weapon's basic functionality. He demonstrated thrusts and throws, proving that the spear's simplicity made it universally effective. Environmental modification. Electromagnetic dead zone, Vextar announced next. The water drained, and a field generator activated. Any weapon dependent on electronic systems would fail in this environment. Several cadets in the audience groaned, realizing their carefully crafted weapons would have been useless. Minho's spear continued working perfectly. It required no electronics, no power systems, nothing that could be disrupted by electromagnetic interference. Environmental modification. Zero gravity, Vextar said. Artificial gravity deactivated. Minho and his spear floated upward. Other weapons would have needed compensation systems or recalibrated trajectories. Minho simply adjusted his throwing technique, using the spear's straightness and balance to guide it accurately toward targets even in the absence of gravity. When the demonstration ended, Minho stood on the combat floor breathing hard, holding his simple wooden spear. The arena was completely silent. The council members conferred among themselves for several minutes, their discussion growing animated. Finally, the Scaloth Elder spoke. "Cadet Minho, your weapon is indeed primitive. It lacks the power and sophistication demonstrated by your classmates. It will never cut through 6 inches of steel or generate gravity wells or fold dimensional space." Minho's heart sank. He had failed after all. "However," the Elder continued, "you have demonstrated something that may be more valuable than raw power. Adaptability, reliability, the ability to function under any circumstances with minimal resources." Another council member, the one whose species Minho still didn't recognize, added, "The most powerful weapon in perfect conditions is less valuable than a functional weapon in all conditions. You have shown us that limitation can breed innovation." Instructor Vexitar stood. "This academy trains warriors for real combat across countless environments and situations. We teach you to create powerful weapons. But Cadet Minho has reminded us that the greatest weapon is the one that never fails when you need it most." The Scaloth Elder made a gesture Minho didn't understand, but the other council members nodded in agreement. "Cadet Minho, you receive our highest marks. Your weapon represents a philosophy that many warriors forget, that sophistication without reliability is merely impressive failure waiting to happen. The arena exploded with sound. Some cadets cheered, others sat in stunned silence, and a few, including Dane, looked angry and confused. Minho walked back to his seat in a daze. Heejin grabbed his arm as he passed and grinned at him. I told you being human meant something. After all presentations concluded, the council announced their final rankings.